I think there's two reasons that I can think of. One is concerning probably it's going to be like supply chain resilience and ironing out risk from within your supply chain. And then I think the second reason is probably more applicable to public sector, where there's a general drive by government for public sector to not always use the same kind of obvious suppliers, but to actually increase the diversity of suppliers in competition for contracts. I think one of the challenges with that at the moment is that sort of small to medium enterprises are not generally on many of the existing frameworks. They're not very proficient at responding to tenders, and there is a challenge there in terms of them being able to access competitions and win them. So I think there's a couple of reasons there around diversity, and then it becomes the how to address the kind of supply chain risk on the one side, and then on the other side getting sort of SMEs to the table more often and getting them winning contracts.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is I think in terms of there's a balance. So sometimes there's an obsession with we need to change suppliers, and there's a view of changing suppliers is a good outcome, and actually you kind of get into this cycle nearly because you're not building strategic relationships with them and you're not really understanding how you extract value, that you get in this loop of every 5 years the supplier and the contract's failed and they haven't delivered what you needed it to do, and therefore you've nearly got a mindset of if we change supplier then everything will be better, but you're probably going to replicate the same mistakes before if you don't manage them properly, and it's not clear what you need, then you're probably not going to get the outcomes you want. But I think the point is a really valid one in terms of diversification, and I think it's forgotten a little bit sometimes in terms of how important that is to build. And I think that's been proven over the last couple of years with things like with the logistical problems and the changes with Brexit and everything else, actually having that resilience in the supply chain so that you're not just reliant upon a single supplier or products coming from a single region. You have to consider how do you actually make that more robust. And do you think, I don't know what you think, Leigh, but do you think is the focus more about price, or is it more about risk in terms of why you think suppliers are focused on diversifying? I think it's probably both. I think if you increase diversity, in theory you increase competition, you bring new potentially hungry entrants to market, but I think diversification by its very nature is a really good hedge against sort of the risk of single supplier failure. I think it's been quite interesting picking up on a comment you just made talking about the kind of COVID era. Lots of businesses came under financial pressure, as we know, and I just wonder how many suppliers to public sector that are out there are actually not in a great state in terms of financial standing. So it's probably worth public sector organisations, or any organisation actually that's procuring from a supplier, if they haven't done a review on the kind of credit risk side with their supply chain, they probably ought to. It's probably a key activity to be undertaken if it's not been done recently. Yeah, I think that's changed a hell of a lot, but I think we do a lot with the SME space, and it's not just an SME challenge. I think it's the same with some of the other organisations. I think there's a real feel that it's a bit of a closed shop, and I think that's a frustration that's shared both sides, if I'm honest, because I think if you speak to clients, they are nearly fed up in some degree of dealing with the same suppliers because they're the only ones that are available, or they're the only ones in public sector that are available on frameworks. And it becomes a very stale marketplace that the suppliers become complacent. There's a lack of innovation. The clients are frustration because they can't do things differently. And I think that's replicated supplier side. They think unless you invest hugely in a dedicated bid team, and it's nearly like an industry on its own, that you can't successfully grow in public sector. And so, from our side, I think we find that really frustrating, that we think there's a real value in bringing in new suppliers and helping them to understand, the procurement process and break that down into a simple thing. But when we're running procurements, we have to make sure that they are easy for these guys to follow, and we're encouraging them to bid and try and break that kind of very stale environment that exists at the moment. I don't know if that's what you see, but
yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the key things with the small to medium enterprises and making it easier for them is that, given those small to medium providers as much notice as possible about competitions and tenders coming out, because I think one of the challenges they have, because they're so thinly resourced, it's the cost of dealing with that opportunity. They need to be kind of galvanised towards it. Otherwise, if they're not expecting the tender, essentially they won't be able to mobilise any kind of resources to bid. The bigger organisations, they have bigger teams and they're able to just pick this stuff up and make it happen. So I think that's a kind of key factor for me as well.
Do you think that organisations are sympathetic enough to how expensive and time consuming it is for people to bid? I get the feeling sometimes that that clients don't necessarily, they're not necessarily dialed into those elements, and actually a lot of these industries now, especially in construction, as it's so competitive, that the balance is shifted to the suppliers in some degree, and they're much more selective about what they're willing to bid on, and how good a job the client's done in terms of building specifications and having a clear routes to market strategy. And if that's not there and it's not articulated, that they're not actually willing to get engaged.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely see that. So yeah, the buying authority has to be very mindful of the market and how the dynamics have swung. I think again over the last few years, there's a lot of work out there now, and yeah, definitely on the supply side, they're picking and choosing about what they get involved with. And sometimes you get funny dates with tenders dropping in. The tenders come out perhaps pre-Christmas or pre a bank holiday weekend, and it just again adds extra pressure to smaller organisations where they've got a small team already and people will be taking holiday, etc. And it kind of just precludes them from getting involved in a lot of cases, and that's not really ideal. So I think that obviously when we work with clients, we obviously do try and sort of steer them away from doing those sorts of things and being more mindful of including SMEs and giving good forward notice and involving them in market engagement and so on.
But I think it's the appropriateness of the profile of the process is what gets lost. So I think what I often see is that there's a tendency within organisations to just dust off the tender document before and go again. And the world's changed, and so what they're asking for isn't appropriate, the solution isn't appropriate, and I think people find it very frustrated that they actually have a better way of doing it, and they're nearly not given that opportunity to articulate that because they're working within the confines. But what I think the SMEs really struggle with is that sometimes the size and the expectations for these tenders is so big and so time consuming that they just dial out, and I don't think necessarily that that's considered enough in terms of the appropriateness of the questions and the size of the documentation and how easy it is to navigate. I don't think that's always factored in to kind of really to appreciate the effort that the suppliers have got put in to respond.
Okay, I completely agree.